Welcome back, everybody. We will start off our poetry segment now, and to chair this is Maggie Wang. Maggie is the Vice President of the Oxford University Poetry Society and a second year studying history and economics at Pembroke College. She's a prize-winning and commended poet in her own right, with prizes from the Young Poets Network and poems appearing in Kin Shard's The Literary Nest, among others. So I'll hand it over to Maggie now. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha, for that introduction. I, as you mentioned, I'm the president of vice president of Oxford University Poetry Society this year, and I'm really delighted to introduce this poetry session. The poetry competition invited writers to submit poems responding to the theme of deep time, and the two winners will receive £100 book tokens as well as publication in the next issue of The Ash, which is the termly magazine of the Oxford University Poetry Society. The Ash is published online and in non-COVID times also in print, and you can find it on the Oxford University Poetry Society's website. Everyone who entered the competition will also have their poems considered for publication in The Ash. And of course, they have had the opportunity to have their poems judged by Jade Cuddle, whom I am here to introduce. Jade is an award-winning poet, folk singer, and plant whisperer. She read French and Russian at the University of Cambridge and received a master's in creative writing at the University of East Anglia with a focus on eco-poetics. In 2017, she was selected as a Ledbury Emerging Poetry Critic, and she now works as arts commissioning editor at The Times. She's known for her album of poem songs, Algal Bloom, and her series of orchid duets, which break down boundaries between spoken word, music, and sound art, while sparking an urgently required discussion about our fraying connection to nature. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jade, who will introduce the winners of the poetry competition.
Thank you. Yeah, it's an honor to be here, and it's an honor also to judge the poems. So yeah, the first winner we have is History, Anglesey, 5th of May 97, by Harriet David. Harriet's not here, but I will be reading Harriet's poem out. We also have the poem Tectonic Time by Sarah Leavesley, who I believe is on this call and is happy to read the poem out. So I will hand over to Leavesley, and well done.
Hi.
Hello.
I'm going to get back in frame. Hi, thank you everyone for the competition and for the conference. And yeah, I'll just read the poem. Tectonic Time. My life's already laying itself down in the future's stone strata. 1,000 years later, perhaps part of the ocean bed. Bones bead a kind of coral strung and bound by plastic shreds. In the sediment, bottle top eyes and carrier bag jellyfish. Distant memories rise from emerald fronds, stirred by currents of melted ice. Assuming green still exists outside of stagnant water. Maybe nothing moves at all, except swirls of flotsam eddying around the last leaf.
Lovely, thank you so much. Yeah, it's an absolutely brilliant poem. I chose it, I guess, for the kind of sharp wake-up call that it gave me. You know, right from the very first line. It kind of really brought home how our actions have consequences, which I think is quite easy to forget, you know, nowadays. And I really enjoyed the kind of unsettling beauty that we get. You know, there's a line about the bones beading a kind of coral, they're strung together and bound by plastic shreds, which, you know, you've got that. It felt really unsettling and beautiful at the same time, which has kind of had a really interesting kind of tension within kind of the reading experience. And yeah, I also felt the language itself was like flotsam, the way the words kind of swelled into one, kind of there's this tide that was rippling through them. It's very unanchored in the sense of, you know, it's free of punctuation, everything kind of flows into each other. So I thought that was a really nice way to kind of explore the ideas, but within the form itself. And yeah, in terms of like the actual content itself, you know, the idea of green becoming extinct as a colour was a fascinating and really original idea that I thought, oh gosh, wow, imagine that. And yeah, yeah, it's very poignant and well done. Thank you for submitting it, and it's a pleasure to read. Yeah, great. So the second poem is sandwiches, and the afternoon curled up under us. The sea expanded by slow grey degrees. It rained. You left your crusts. 100 million years, brave knights, fat dinosaurs, came up behind us in our rear view mirror. The soldier wiped his forehead, raised his sword. Men marched out of the sea. On the wet rocks, we saw one woman in a purple coat. Stooping, considering, she stopped and clambered on. She was already quite far out, moving with open arms against the day. We kissed to give ourselves a chance to look away. So that was History Anglesey, 5th of May 97, by Harriet David. And I'll just give a quick comment on this poem, even though Harriet can't be here, just to explain why I chose this one as the second winner. What I loved about this poem was the fluidity, the way that you have the shape of the prawns and sandwiches spilling over into the description of the afternoon curling up under us. So the afternoon curls up like a prawn as well, which was really exciting and original. You have the crust of the bread roll that begin to link to the Earth's crust. And the last line in particular stuck with me. I felt that was very brutal and moving. We kissed to give ourselves a chance to look away. And what this poem did actually was it kind of brought to the forefront of my mind our relationship with climate change and the idea of looking the other way. You know, this gave us a chance to look away, and how such actions can be damaging for our planet. And I'd say that many of the poems actually submitted to this prize did actually explore a similar idea. And you know, they all impressed me with how closely they managed to tune into these issues and you know, inspire the reader to try and engage at a more heartfelt and successful level with such issues. I mean, this is something I've been exploring recently quite a lot. I judged the Ginkgo Eco Prize for the Poetry School with Simon Armitage, and yeah, we were looking for poems that really move us and try to inspire us to take action to help the planet. I expanded on this in an essay that I wrote for the Poetry School, and brought in notions of deep time as well, which is why I think this conference today is really exciting. If you're interested in having a look at the essay, it's called Re-examining the Poem as Ecological Terreau. I did French and Russian at uni, so very much interested in kind of Roland Barthes and ideas of how poetic form can link to the earth. So terreau means earth and its layers, which those of you today kind of studying deep time will kind of, I imagine, know lots about. I'm very interested in the idea of deep time and the layers of the earth and how this kind of links to poetic form. I expand on it much more in the essay, but a kind of a brief potted version for anyone who might be interested. The essay explores a theory that I've kind of been developing in my master's and outside for a debut book that I'm working on. It explores the idea that the very act of scanning through the layers of poetic text, in particular eco-poetic text, because this motivates us to take action positively towards the earth. This very action of scanning through layers, basically when I talk about layers, I'm talking about strata, so the idea of text being composed in lines, linear strata, that this can psychosomatically return us to a prehistoric, pre-linguistic mindset when we as human beings were all foragers. So the idea that reading poetry, engaging with poetry, interpreting poetry, composing poetry in these lines and layers is a way to reconnect us with the earth in a way that is urgently required. I use the word foraging in this essay to kind of capture that process of excavating meaning from a poetic text. It's very nourishing. Reading all these poems was very nourishing to the imagination and a pleasure as well. But then I also bring in the idea of psychosomatic in the sense that entering these eco poems it's often a traumatic experience, because it's a portal not only to the past or the present, but also the future and the traumas that our planet and human civilization will continue to suffer unless we take action. In the poem Tectonic Time that has just been read for us, for example, I think we see this quite clearly. The line, "My life is already laying itself down in the future's stone strata." And of course in the ending as well, with the last leaf, the very last leaf, and the idea that one day there might not be any more green left. I mentioned that entering that poem, for example, was an unsettling experience, and the more you kind of dig down through the layers of the text, the more poignant it becomes, which is basically the idea of reconceptualizing linear arrangement of a poetry as strata. And yeah, it's a beautiful experience. The poems that we've just heard, is really lovely to have had the chance to read them, and congratulations again to the winners. I look forward to reading more of your work. If anyone is interested in what I'm been working on, I'm on social media at Jade Cuttle, and got a website, jadecuttle.com. Thank you so much, and look forward to hearing from you soon.
Thank you so much to Jade for judging this competition. Again, we're really honored to have you speak to us about your experience of reading these poems and your work as well. Thank you to everyone who entered their poems, and congratulations to the two winners. If you didn't catch the poems, or if you'd like to reread them, they will be in the Michaelmas issue of The Ash, which will be published in December. So keep an eye out for that. You can find that on the Oxford University Poetry Society website, or if you follow us on social media as well. And I'll now hand over to Tim, who will introduce the next session.
Great, thank you so much to Maggie and Jade and to all of the poets. So we're going to move straight on to the next session, which is called Deep Time Literatures. And I'm delighted to introduce Tess Somerville, who is going to be chairing this session for us. Tess is a lecturer in English at Worcester College, Oxford, and her research interests include nature writing, eco-criticism, the long poem, and time in literature. And her first book, Reading Time in the Long Poem, is forthcoming with Edinburgh University Press. So over to you, Tess, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. And I mean, hearing those fantastic poems and about Jade's work leads us perfectly into this session on deep time literature. We'll use the same format as we've seen in the session so far. So I'll introduce both our speakers, and we'll have both papers before we open the floor to your questions. So please keep the questions coming in the Q&A. I mean, these speakers, I'm sure, don't need any introduction, but I will introduce them anyway. We're very lucky to have two of the world's foremost eco-critics speaking to us this afternoon. I think that's fair to say, Kate Rigby and David Farrier. Our first speaker is Kate Rigby, who is Professor of Environmental Humanities at Bath Spa University and Adjunct Professor at Monash University in Australia. She was the founding president of the Association for the Study of Literature and the Environment, Australia, New Zealand. And her wonderful previous books include Topographies of the Sacred, The Poetics of Place in European Romanticism, and Dancing with Disaster, Environmental Histories, Narratives and Ethics for Perilous Times. So we'll hear from Kate first, and then secondly from David Farrier, who is Professor of Literature and the Environment at the University of Edinburgh. He's the author of also wonderful books, Anthropocene Poetics, Deep Time, Sacrifice Zones and Extinction from 2019, and Footprints in Search of Future Fossils from 2002. And Footprints was awarded the Royal Society of Literature's Giles St. Aubyn Prize for Non-Fiction and has been translated into 8 languages. So as I say, we're very fortunate to have these 2 speakers with us this afternoon, and I will hand over to Kate to speak to us first.
Thanks very much, Tess. I'm going to share my screen, and I want to begin by saying how grateful I am to you all for this invitation. But also to Michelle for her recognition of country. As it turns out, I too was born and raised on Ngunnawal country. I guess it's pertinent to recall that Australian Indigenous culture is thought to be the most enduring on Earth, actually. So when we're thinking about deep time, we can kind of do less than engaging in conversation with Indigenous Australians. I would also like to say thank you to Diane Pachitti, whose poetry I'm going to discuss in my short presentation today. Diane is here, so thank you very much, Diane. Actually, I'd also like to say thank you to Jim Hatley, who is my other sort of main interlocutor here, and I noticed that Jim is here as well. So this is very nice, but also slightly daunting. I hope I don't get it all wrong. So I'm going to begin with some poetry from Diane's most recent collection, Dark Angelic Mills, which was the outcome of her 2019 residency at Bradford Cathedral. And in this collection, Diane opens her meditations on the genesis of the city with an invocation of the vastly more than human becoming of this place across the millennia. Before one brick of this city could be laid, continents had to clash and be remade. In the beginning was no mind of man, no human timescale, but a God span of transformation. Age on age must plane and gouge a landscape, constantly made again. Recalling also the historical time frame of industry and empire, fueled by the consumption of that combustion, of that darkly sleeping seam of fossilized plant matter, the mortal remains of ancient tropical forests. The poem concludes with an affirmation of the poem's calling to also chronicle human need, and like its cathedral, to embrace all that is broken in one sheltering place. This poem and the collection as a whole demonstrates how poetic writing, whether in verse or prose, can help to cultivate the virtue of temporal discernment, ways of thinking about, inhabiting and acting within a deep time perspective that acknowledges but is not enthralled to the geological, recognizing as well the necessity of endeavoring to negotiate a plurality of potentially conflictual temporalities, if we are to keep our ethical balance in the choppy waters of our perilous present and perhaps contribute to renewed social ecological flourishing in the future. I take the concept of temporal discernment from a memorable keynote that Jewish environmental philosopher James Hatley delivered at the 2009 meeting of the Australian Ecological Humanities Collective. And this has been published in the journal Environmental Philosophy in 2012. Hatley opened his address by showing a graph based on estimates of the number of species lost in the 5 last mass extinction events, and of those that survived or evolved after each of these crashes over the past 500 million years or so of Earth's history. He observed that from a purely biogeophysical perspective, there's nothing particularly unusual about Earth's current slide into another extinction event. Nor is this something necessarily to be regretted, since the fossil record indicates that species numbers not only rebounded, but exceeded what had gone before each of the previous crashes, with the most dramatic efflorescence occurring during the Cenozoic era, into which our own kind emerged, along with a number of other hominid species who didn't fare so well, a mere 300,000 years ago. Why should we not expect yet another rebound from this newly minted episode of species extinction 1 million to 50 million years or so down the line? Hatley asked provocatively in the published article. And why should we object if such a time frame makes mincemeat of our all too human notions of the good, including the good that we might see in the avoidance or at least delay of our own extinction? Similarly, I would add, in view of the geological record of past climatic changes, might we not also view with a degree of equanimity the current ratcheting up of the planetary thermostat? After all, a major supervolcanic eruption, such as that which is bound to occur in what will have been Yellowstone National Park, or a massive meteor strike, is likely to put all our worst efforts thus far in the shade. Yet, as Hatley went on to argue, a time of anthropogenic mass extinction, and I would add planetary heating, names an event that is unique and heretofore unimaginable within human history. Viewed historically, it is also one that has an ethico-political horizon, demanding attention to differentiated responsibilities and unequal impacts, and inviting reconsideration of those big questions with which human beings, peculiar critters that we are, have always grappled, but that now confront us anew in unprecedented circumstances. What does it mean to be this being that we take ourselves to be, rather than, say, a volcano or a meteor, a bacterium or a bear? What are we good for? And how should we relate to other beings, including those not of our kind? Throughout human history, and for many people still today, consideration of these questions has been prompted and shaped by a plethora of creation narratives. Unlike modern scientific accounts of the formation of the cosmos, our planet and its evolutionary history, these narratives are concerned less with causality than with consequence, matters of meaning, value, and purpose that are quite properly not the purview of the sciences. The virtue of temporal discernment in my reading entails respect not only for the historical dimension per se, but also for culturally diverse answers to these fundamental questions, which frequently encode different and potentially conflicting understandings of temporal trajectories and temporal orientation. The creation narrative that goes to the title of Pachitti's poem, Godspan, is one shared and variously interpreted by Jews and Christians alike, namely the Hebrew text known as Bereshit, in the beginning in the Torah, and Genesis 1 in the Bible. This tricky tale, which has at times been set to undeniably toxic purposes, is one that I too am revisiting in my current work, with a view to reimagining it through a post-patriarchal, post-anthroparchal, and decolonizing lens. And I'm doing so in conversation with others from a number of faith-based conservation and activist initiatives around the world, and of course, in the horizon of mass extinction and climate crisis, the great discreation that is unfolding as we speak. Hatley too has turned to this narrative in association with his consideration of a further temporality, which, following Emmanuel Levinas, he terms the immemorial. the paradoxical time out of time, in which all things are perpetually being summoned into existence by what Hatley calls the Most High. For creation, in this understanding, is not some one-off event that can be pinpointed in the distant past, but a continuous calling forth here and now, creatio continuo, as it's known in some theologies, which in the case of humankind entails also a calling towards the other, conjoining gratitude for the incalculable gift of one's own existence and for the innumerable more than human lives from which yours has emerged and by which it is sustained, with an ethical responsibility with respect to fellow living creatures, human and otherwise, in the precarity of their existence, not only here and now, but potentially also into the future. In Godspan, Bradford, the riverine origins of which are recalled in the series title, Genesis, Broad Ford, these three temporalities are braided together, as this place is disclosed as subject to ongoing biophysical forces, including now the unintended climate-altering consequences of a particular human history of fossil capitalism and imperial conquest, along with a cultural inheritance with a particular conception of what abides immemorially in the call to attend to human need amidst all that is broken in one sheltering place. Pachitti's coinage of a Godspan of transformation, it should be stressed, disavows any claim to decode in divine intentionality. This is precisely not an account of God's plan, whilst nonetheless holding open the possibility of the inherence of divine grace in the immemorially deep time of creatio continuo. Elsewhere in this collection, Pachitti's verse engages discerningly with two other temporalities that I would like to add to those discussed by Hatley, namely the time out of contemplative encounter and the conditional future of the prophetic imagination. These correspond to two types of ecopoetics that I've traced within the literary and philosophical inheritance of European Romanticism in my most recent book, in fact from last year, Reclaiming Romanticism Towards an Ecopoetics of Decolonization. And here I exemplify these two forms of ecopoetics with respect to the verse of William Wordsworth, in which I identify a contemplative ecopoetics, and William Blake, whose prophetic ecopoetics, of course, ghosts this volume of Pachitti's. Contemplative ecopoetics refers to a mode of writing that requires, instantiates, and entrains a slowing down, a conscious stilling, drawing us away from the hustle and bustle and perpetual distractedness of our 24/7 wired up, sped up world, and inviting us to attend to whatever or whoever is before us, unbidden, here and now. For Pachitti, and incidentally for Wordsworth, that includes those other than human beings with their own temporalities, whose inner worlds exceed our merely human grasp, whom we might encounter even in highly humanized spaces, such as the half-glimpsed critter that plunges away from our straining eyes, a vanished quiver of tails, scale flash, quick silver streak of minnow recalled in fellow travelers. Invoking also what Hatley calls the zoogenetic temporality of evolutionary entanglement, this poem affirms both our kinship with our companions, creatures of the flood and air path, the plants of heavy earth, the persistent presence of insect, bird or cloud and reaching tree, and their abiding otherness. These, our fellow travelers, are close but elusive, far homelier than our notion of angels, more mysterious than our colonizing brains dare to allow. To allow ourselves to be led by them in imagination beyond the safe seal of skin, the boundary of breath to the silence of encounter, Pachitti concludes, is an act which some might call prayer. Yet in the poem that follows, Voices from the Other Side, Pachitti's contemplative ecopoetics morphs into the prophetic mode, drawing closer to the voice of Blake than Wordsworth, Blake, whose dark satanic mills are at once invoked and revoked in the title of the collection, Dark Angelic Mills. This poem issues a warning from the imagined perspective of those, human and otherwise, who will inherit the damage wrought by capitalist industrialism and neo-colonialism, whilst recalling also the voices of some of those who had been exploited in the process, specifically the polluted waters and oppressed workers of Bradford's industrial past. You did not listen to those two other voices. Why should you hear me cry from the near future? You think you will somehow dodge. Your poisonous dyes shut into streams, your giant chimneys smoked as if addicted. You sold us progress. I, who consumed little, am the first to be swept away. The sea cannot scream, its mouth is choked with plastic. The land cannot shout, it has become trashed sea. What was my island struggles to stretch its last gasp of earth throat, its fast drowning peak above the waves. Do not feel virtuous when you rescue me in one of your big ships. Rather be warned, the tree, animal, bird, everything that makes this bold, always fallible earth experiment is almost beyond rescue. Pray with deeds. The conditional future temporality of the prophetic imagination might, with due caution, be termed messianic, not in the sense of awaiting divine intervention, but of discerning in the perilous present an epochal turning point, a time known in Jewish and Christian thought as a kairos moment, when the choices made now will have a decisive impact on the future. Today, that future too needs to be considered with temporal discernment. Will the traces of the anthropogenic alteration of the planet that we are told be legible for millennia to come, only bear the dismal record of exploitation and degradation? Or will they also hint at practices of attentive care and restorative justice? And how might alternative possible futures and potential pathways be parsed and prefigured through plural cultural, historical, and ethico-political lenses? These, I think, are some of the key questions for literary studies and the humanities more broadly in the horizon of multiple conceptions of deep time. And with respect to literary studies in particular, I think that this necessitates moving outside the sort of enclosure of national literatures towards a kind of richly, deeply transnational and decolonial form of literary studies, as well as, of course, reaching out to engage with and intersect with and co-create with other disciplines within and beyond the humanities, and perhaps this is something we can take up a little bit more in the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kate, for a rich, fascinating, beautiful paper. We'll, as I say, we'll take questions after we've heard both papers. So if I can hand over now to David for our second talk.
Hi, I'm just going to share my screen as well. Okay. I hope everyone can see that. Holler if not.
We can see it. Great.
Good. For Christmas 1934, Loreen Nidecker presented her fellow poet Louis Zukowski with a gift. Next year, or I Fly My Rounds Tempestuous, is an artist's book made by Nidecker which transforms a mass-produced and commonplace calendar into a playful reflection on the inherent difficulty of marking time. Nidecker pasted over the homilies printed on each page of her 1935 sunlit road calendar and wrote in her own brief, laconic verses. For example, this, which is effectively the first poem in the book. Wade all life backward to its source, which runs too far ahead. By remaking this tool of everyday timekeeping as a gift, Nidecker asks how else we might attend to our place in time. The calendar makes time disposable, the pages torn out as weeks pass, while the gift is immutable. Where the calendar consumes time, in next year it is composed in a gesture of creative friendship. As Genevieve Cohen-Cheminey has observed, Nidecker's poems hold times common and future together. Ostensibly meant to be read week by week, if read in a single sitting, as Zhukovsky would no doubt have done, they offer a proleptic experience of companionship stretching out across the year. Weird-All Life foregrounds the peculiar quality of what Jonathan Culler has called poetry's special now. As Kate has just observed in her paper, creation is not a single moment, but a continual calling forth, here and now. That is, a now that also encompasses other reaches of time. And the same is true of lyric, Culler writes, in its lyric, Culler writes, in its presentation of an iterable now. No matter how old or familiar, we always encounter a poem in its own present, but within an open temporal horizon. We enter a moment that is always visited afresh, but in which we can also revolve or linger, run backwards or ahead. This temporal horizon can extend into very deep time. As Cohen-Cheminey notes, the calendar format makes the work potentially endless. An infinite number of poems stands in reserve. Time spills its bounds in next year. And this quality of excess makes it a useful starting point for thinking about how poetry can mark time. Poetry is open in the way the gift is open. As Lynn Heginian puts it, open to the world and particularly to the reader. Where the closed poem directs the reader towards a single reading, the open poem resists reduction and commodification. Like Kate, I'm interested in the poem as a means of temporal discernment. I'm mindful too that 1935, the year commemorated in Nidecker's gift, was also to be a year of closures. That year, the final images of a thylacine were filmed in Hobart Zoo. The animal, thought to be the last of its kind, died the following year. 1935 also saw the extinction of, among other species, the Mogollon mountain wolf and the southern Rocky mountain wolf. In thinking about the relationship between literature and deep time, I'd like to pull these threads together, the gift, the poem as a way of marking time and extinction, by looking at another poem concerned with life's continuous call to renewal, Varney Capildeo's Dog or Wolf. Capildeo's poem responds to a small bronze figure encountered in the Ashmolean Museum. Ambiguously labelled dog or wolf, the figure is one of 14 of humans and animals discovered in the Apennines in 1800 and made between 900 and 780 BCE. Together they form a scene of armed human figures confronting a wolf with a lamb in its jaws. Attached to a copper disc, it was a votive object, a sacrifice made during the festival of Upakai to protect the flock from wolves and make them fruitful. The relic was therefore a gift intended to police the nature-culture boundary and to secure the immediate future against scarcity. All the animals apart from the dog-wolf figure are clearly identifiable, but the ambiguous dog-wolf speaks also to another, more open temporality. The curved tail suggests the softened, puppy-like features of the domesticated dog, the large pricked ears, the wildness of the wolf. The figure therefore encompasses the reach of time in which Canis lupus transformed into Canis lupus familiaris. DNA studies have suggested that dogs diverged from wolves at least 27,000 years ago. Despite being no more than 3,000 years old, the dog-wolf figure opens upon the intertwining of species across millennia of evolutionary time. Capildeo's poem interrogates the certainty offered by boundaries, whether between species or genres. The opening phrase dog or wolf is answered by another pairing, verse or prose. But the poem itself, as Jeremy Noel Todd observes, queries the neat separation of these taxonomic pairs by alternating between verse and lineated prose. By its form, the poem insists that such boundaries are porous or entangled. Both the dog-wolf bronze figure and Capildeo's response to it can be understood as figures in Donna Haraway's sense, knots in which diverse bodies and meanings co-shape one another, rather than representations. They warn against either fixating upon division as the root metaphor of Western culture, or fetishizing the wolf as the preeminent icon of wildness. Rather, they each offer an opening for what Haraway might call chimerical thinking. The poem speaks, as it were, in the voice of the dog-wolf as it addresses its human companions. I choose to sing to the hairless who silken my path with their killings, my hills and plains pitted with cattle and cities and middens. They reek of nerves arrogant. I raise my nose jubilant. We crouch, we loom. The dog-wolf song is one of competing territorial claims, of hills and plains transformed into cities and pasture, but it is not straightforwardly antagonistic. Human incursions silken my path, the dog-wolf declares, a process that calls to mind Vinciane Despret's definition of domestication as practices in which animals and people become more available to each other. Uncertainty persists as to whether people domesticated wolves or wolves insinuated their way into human companionship. But as Haraway points out, the emergence of any nature culture is a collaborative process, a still ongoing story of coevolution involving agencies of many sorts. The ambivalence persists in the indefinite present tense of we crouch, we loom. Crouch could refer to the submissive posture of the dog or the wolf readying to attack. Loom to the predator's threatening presence or to a weaving together of companion species. Dog or wolf illustrates how capacious the lyric now can be. Just as in Nidecker's Next Year, time both wades backwards and runs ahead, Capildeo's dog-wolf figure surveys the multimillennial process of assembling companion species, less a category, Haraway notes, than a pointer to an ongoing becoming with. As Deborah Bird-Rose explains, seen from the perspective of intergenerational or even evolutionary time, all life is a gift relationship that must be understood in the context of deep time. Drawing on James Hatley's concept of the death narrative, the intergenerational transmission of memory and tradition through which one experiences one's time as a gift, and one in turn offers this gift to those who come after, Rose posits that all living things constitute the embodiment of this gifted time, both by sequence, as life is handed on from generation to generation, and by synchrony, as predator receives life from prey or genetic material circulates in lateral exchange. All creatures form dense knots of embodied time. Life is therefore a form of poiesis, a mutual making, but this embodied time, or what Rose calls ethical time, is undone by what she calls, borrowing again from Hatley, death work, a will towards totality which refuses the call of others. Death work is the rupturing of the flow of life's gift, prefigured in the cattle and cities and middens which crowd Capildeo's poem. Habitat loss, industrialized agriculture, pollution, and climate change are all driving a decline in biodiversity and the potential extinction of up to 1 million species by the end of the century. Since the bronze dog-wolf figure was cast, wolf populations have plummeted worldwide. The story becomes a catalogue of local extinctions, and despite programs to reintroduce wolves to North America, for example, the relationship between human and wolf remains uneasy. This unmaking of the gifted world also eradicates the future complex richness of life, just as Next Year stands open to a potentially unlimited series of poems. Any given creature stands at the head of a wave of countless descendants. We can therefore read the dog wolf's gentle howling in the context of this vocative quality of ethical time. Death narratives are vocative, Hatley states. They call to one's survivors for some mode of response. And the future too may call out to us, Rose adds. The dog wolf's call is a howl through embodied time. An agglomeration of moons tumbles through my glottis, sounding through the long and short O sounds scattered throughout the poem. Dog, wolf, prose, choose, croon, nose, crouch, loom, moon, wounding, sounding. The dog wolf's call is heard along the entire knotted species arc, from its collaborative origins to its precarious and potentially ruptured future. Rose turns to another ambivalent animal to describe the deep time reach of this gentle howling. Canis lupus dingo is both wild and companion species, loathed by pastoralists but acknowledged by Indigenous Australians as the first non-human who answered back, who came when called. Dingoes are not domesticated, but since their arrival in Australia around 5,000 years ago, they have become in many ways, with the Indigenous population. Sheep farmers, settler sheep farmers whose will to total domination of the land means they refuse all too often the call of others, will sometimes kill a dingo and mount its corpse on a fence to ward away other predators. For Rose, these broken creatures are figures of Walter Benjamin's Angel of History. I am imagining the Angel of History as a wild dog. I hear her howling with all the complex vocabulary of her kind. She is calling out to try to find her companions, not only dingoes, but humans as well. Westerners face the future, the past is behind, Rose writes. By contrast, Indigenous Australians face the source. The image is of generations of people returning to the dreaming, the continual calling forth of country into being. For Benjamin's angel, the past is one long calamity of division, but the wild dog's call is to return to the process of perpetual becoming with that marks all species in embodied time, without which any and all futures are foreclosed. As Kate says, creation is creatio continuo, a continuous calling forth here and now. This is also the recursive temporality of the lyric now, in which the poem sings into being its own renewal. Poetry can give shape to multi-species knots as they are woven, ruptured, and woven again. With the macaronic last line of Capildeo's poem, Good lupo, optimum dog, the dog wolf might seem to have decided in favour of domestication, but the mixing of dead and living languages adds a further temporal twist. What Colour calls the oddity of lyric enunciation is ultimately a profound strangeness, capable not only of encompassing very deep time, but also of figuring, giving shape to the wild dog's call, a call to wade all life backwards to its source, which runs too far ahead.
Thank you so much, David. I mean, thank you, David and Kate, for two wonderful papers. Before we open the floor to questions from all the listeners, I just wondered if either you, Kate or David, wanted to start us off by responding to one another's papers or reflecting on the panel as a whole, how your talks spoke to one another.
I'm happy to kick off while David catches his breath after his wonderful talk. In preparing for today, it did cross our minds that we are both people who are very much involved with talking about poetry. And so I think that the question of, literary studies and deep time may well have been addressed rather differently if you'd had speakers who are kind of principally concerned with, prose fiction, for example, and perhaps we can talk a little bit about that, the particular affordances and limitations also of prose fiction, which has been much discussed within environmental literary studies. But I guess one thing that really struck me, David, when you were speaking was that your recollection of Debbie's reworking of, you know, Benjamin's Angel of History as the dingo is one of the ways that I had been thinking about the title of Diane's collection, Dark Angelic Mills, and thinking that one way of kind of reading that, I mean, clearly it introduces a kind of a dissonance and a kind of a deep ambivalence vis-a-vis Blake's Dark Satanic Mills, but one of the ways that it resonates for me is in view of that figure of the Angel of History who was being blown back into the future with his back to the future, and all the Angel of History can see is a pile of debris. And yet the pile of debris is what, you know, certainly in the early 20th century when Benjamin was writing, and I think for many people today as well, is called progress. And to hold in tension those kind of different views of the past, in the shadow of which we are standing, and that the shadow of which will be cast long into the future. The ambivalence of the pile of debris and progress is, you know, is something that poetry and literature in general, I think it can do, and other art forms as well. You know, what art is good at is disclosing dissonances and ambivalences and contradictions, and resisting the kind of all too hasty rush to kind of a definitive answer and a singular perspective. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm glad that, I'm interested that connection was there. We did just sort of discuss our papers in advance, and we were aware we were both leaning quite heavily on James Hatley. Thank you, yes, James, for underpinning both our papers. But yeah, we didn't talk about the angel. That's interesting. I think for me, it's about how a literary work allows us to, I guess, step outside that the way in which presentism and commodifies time, and makes it, you know, I guess sort of as we move through it in this very kind of progress-oriented fashion, it kind of erases that sense of what's gone before. It's a kind of, it consumes what went before. You know, it encourages a kind of amnesia, a kind of scorched earth. And for me, I think what your paper was doing, and certainly what I was trying to express, was a sense of a literary work as a place for that kind of movement backwards and forwards, a kind of a shuttling between that allows connections to be made, that encourages us to think, and this sort of perhaps gesturing back to earlier papers in the day as well, to think about time itself as a gift, as our place in deep time as gifted. I mean, if we encounter the gift, we don't just encounter that moment of exchange. In a sense, we encounter the whole chain of exchanges that preceded it, and we open out onto, you know, what will follow, you know, the exchanges that will follow, that irresolvable sense of always moving the gift on, that of course may be ruptured, but is inherent to that idea of time as gifted rather than as simply consumed. So yeah, I'm interested in the angel, partly because it's that figure of the angel of history. We focus, don't we, on the horror of the ruin heaped up at the angel's feet, but I think an equal horror that's not actually acknowledged often in response to that is the horror, the blindness to the future. The angel can't see where she's going, or he's going. It's, and in a sense, I think that heedless blindness, appetite-driven sense of time as progress is there in both that devastation of the past and that blindness to what might come, that blindness to consequences. Whereas what we find with Debbie's reworking of this is a calling into kind of companionship with past and future, which I think is what we need.
Absolutely, and I mean, I think that links up very much also with Michelle's sort of call to think about time in terms of kinship, and there's a sort of link there, obviously, with Debbie also being very much in conversation with Indigenous Australian perspectives on multi-species kinship, and so on. Yeah.
Could I ask a question of you, Kate? What do you, I mean, I was really, one of the part of your paper that one of the parts that got its hooks into my thinking was this idea of the ethical political horizon. What do you feel is the ethical political horizon of the poem or the novel or the literary work? You know, what is its orientation in that sense, and how open is that?
Well, I think that's going to, partly depend upon reception, isn't it? You know, the ethical political horizon is, in a sense, established in the reading and the taking forward of what has been drawn from that text. So I don't think it's something that's fixed, and that's another way of thinking also about creatio continua, that that the artwork is not sort of fixed with the words on the page, but continues to unfold and to become with others and to become other things and ways of being. I think one of the things that I really wanted to emphasize, and this too resonates with the challenge that Michelle threw out to us previously, is that I agree that it's important not to sort of be enthralled to the kind of geological and scientific narrative of deep time, because I mean, what Jim, I think, draws our attention to is that within a purely kind of scientific account, you have an account of causation of one thing after another. It's one damn thing after another. You know, it's an extinction event, it's sort of respeciation, it's another extinction event, so on and so forth. And that actually doesn't give us any kind of ethico-political horizon, nor should it. That's not the job of science, right? But this is where the arts and humanities are so important, because that those kind of emerging understandings of the physical world that we inhabit need to be interpreted. They need to be engaged with in terms of culturally relative, perhaps historically situated conceptions of meaning and value and purpose. And this is why this is kind of foundational, I suppose, for the environmental humanities. And the other thing that I think is relevant to the kind of wider question of literary studies in deep time is that literary studies are they're kind of magpie-like. I'm not sure if does that metaphor work with European magpies? I'm not sure, but anyway, literary scholars are very happy to kind of grab kind of knowledge from all kinds of other areas, aren't they? So I think that literary scholars are very happy to, oh yes, we can engage with the deep time narrative, the geologists, and we can talk about the Anthropocene and so on and so forth. That's absolutely not a problem for literary scholars, but to do so in a way that resists the charisma of the sciences, I think is really, really important, because otherwise all we do is we point to the way in which this or that literary text might simply, communicate a scientific narrative rather than actually present something that isn't on an angle to that, or that has another job to do.
Yeah.
So anyway.
We have a comment from Richard Irvin in the chat. Richard, as you're a panelist, I think you're able to turn on your mic if you wanted to ask your question directly.
Yeah, no, I mean, I just sort of a note of caution about this kind of, I mean, I think about this particular approach to thinking about science and the scientific way of thinking about deep time as being detached from any of these moral and political elements. A lot of the historic sources that we're drawing upon when we're thinking about the emergence of the deep time concept did explicitly link deep time thinking with its moral implications, and we're very concerned at any move that would sever that. So, you know, I'm thinking about, you know, people like Sedgwick, who in his debates with Darwin was very specifically concerned about the loss of the final cause that would link that would link deep time to man's moral destiny. So that I think we mustn't be anachronistic here and think, well, just because 21st or 20th century scientists act like they're apolitical, the 19th and 18th century ones that are our sources for deep time thinking, you know, they weren't. They were explicitly engaged in these things and saw it as a form of moral discourse.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Richard. And my own work has been a lot with romantic science, and certainly that connection is very much there as well. And actually, also one of the things I've been doing recently is researching the history of meditations on Genesis 1, and they kind of go up to the 17th century, and what they actually are very much in conversation with the kind of natural history, natural philosophy of the day, but also they're very much also engaged with theological and spiritual and moral questions. And so in that kind of genre of meditations on Genesis 1, you had this kind of bringing together of questions about kind of, you know, the materiality of the world, with the question of how humans should comport themselves within it. And although, as you know, Richard points out, though that connection was not completely lost, it's really interesting that there is a sort of that genre disappears, and the sort of reflection upon the physical world is very much kind of handed over to the emerging kind of physical sciences and biological sciences subsequently, and sort of, you know, theology kind of gets to a certain extent, to a considerable extent, sort of confined to more sort of human-centered kind of questions about human morality, the morality of human relations with one another. And I think that there was a sort of, something was really kind of lost in that sort of partial bifurcation, which, as Richard reminds us, was not complete. But yeah.
Well, I can't wait to read what you've been writing on that, Kate. Sorry, David, were you about to come in?
No, I was just thought maybe we could sort of approach the other side of that and think about the, you know, what are the claims that literary writing can make and literary studies can substantiate. It strikes me that you know, essentially what we do as literary critics is we think about and with form. It's, you know, different aspects of literary form, you know, the way in which narrative or perception and language are shaped, in particular inherited ways and then innovative ways as well. And I suppose I'd like to hear what Kate has to say about, given you mentioned the novel earlier, which is something that we've not thought about. I mean, what is distinctive about what literary critical practice can do in framing a sense of deep time?
Well, that's a big question. I'm going to answer it slightly aslant, actually, which is to say that I want to actually pick up on something that Amanda Powell said at the beginning of the day with respect to the discipline of history, and that really interesting conversation that she had with Richard about history and anthropology, and, you know, how they need to be in conversation with one another, and that you know, how the kind of social ecological kind of challenges that we're facing kind of call for an experimentation and an expansion of our methods. And one of the things that I'm quite interested in, although I haven't engaged in it myself, but is the what's being called an empirical eco-criticism. So it's more kind of really engaging with the sociology of literature, because, you know, David, you know, you and I love literature. We think it matters. We like to think that literary studies matter in some way. And yet often our claims for the kind of efficacy, the work that literature can do are kind of very much untested. And so there's some really quite interesting work being done to actually look at the extent to which literary texts can resonate with people in ways that might actually influence how they act in the world. So I think that that is something that that I'm very interested in. The other thing that I think is really important is the sort of interface with ethnography that some literary scholars are engaging in, and actually looking at the kind of forms of reception that are sort of embedded within wider communities of reading, rather than the solitary scholar, you know, coming out with their, you know, yet another interpretation of Wordsworth and so on, which, you know, I've just done in my last book. But actually looking what, you know, sort of reading and working with literary text, literary heritage, with particular communities in particular circumstances, and thinking about how that literature kind of might translate into different ways of being in the world. And so, you know, I really feel that literary studies, particularly within their national boundaries, have been quite sort of enclosed within a kind of hermeneutic and historical space. I just think there's some really, really interesting experiments to get involved with that go beyond that purely kind of literary historical hermeneutic space, and are much more engaged with communities and practices of reading and you know, and doing stuff with what has been read, you know, thinking about, well, you know, what where does this take us? Yeah.
We have a couple of related questions in the Q&A. Marsha asks, a formidable literary challenge is to get people interested in narratives without human protagonists, or is that by definition outside the purview of the humanities? And another perhaps related question is, how is literary studies communicated outside academia to make an impact on the public's awareness of the ecological crisis? So I don't know if either Kate or David, you had any thoughts about either of those questions.
I mean, it's almost an impossible task, isn't it? I guess to have any, you know, to cleanse any kind of literary narrative or literary entity of a human perspective, or, you know, indeed any kind of purchase on human concerns. I always think of Alice Oswald's statement that her object is to, you know, which she acknowledges is an impossible one, is to force her eye behind the flower. And I think wherever that is, you know, wherever that is the object, it has to be recognized that it will involve failure. It will involve some kind of, it will reach a kind of limit. And yet I think that ideal, that striving to embrace a profound otherness and a profound decentering of the human is an extremely valuable one. On the second question, and I'll just say something briefly on this, because I'm sure Kate has many thoughts as well. I am just very wary of that idea of literary studies is primarily a kind of vehicle for communication. I'm much more interested and much more, or less alarmed, I might say, when we think about literary studies as a distinct mode of inquiry. I worry about as Kate's indicated, grand claims for what literary studies can do when it starts waving a flag for certain ideas or claiming it to be a kind of mouthpiece. I'm much more interested, and I think it's far more. I think it's a lot less self-aggrandizing, certainly, to think about what we might do as literary critics to find distinctive ways of approaching common questions by applying the criteria, applying the inherited traditions of our own discipline. To think about poetry itself, for example, as Lynn Jenian puts it, as a particular language of inquiry, a mode of investigation particular to itself.
I think you've already started to answer Anthony Huon's question about blindness and muteness as the metaphors for the relationship between humankind and nature, David, when you were talking about the failure inherent in any kind of figurative language.
Yeah. I mean, but it's I don't want to say kind of noble failure, but it's a necessary one. I think it's inherent to the task, isn't it, to throw our imaginations beyond ourselves. That is, I think, part of the ethical horizon of a literary work, and therefore, for us as readers of it to engage with that.
I think with that most recent question, there's a danger with these metaphors that they are discriminatory in a sense, the privilege, sort of an ableist kind of discourse. So I think that it's important to be careful with those metaphors. And it's interesting in the case of Diane's use of those terms, this is not because inherently the sea and the land cannot articulate themselves, but because they have been silenced through trash, and also through our inattention, our carelessness that contributed to their trashing. With respect to the first couple of questions, there's a really fantastic novella. I noticed that somebody else also asked about short stories. A wonderful novella by a Swedish author, and I can't remember her name now, but I think it's just called Dog. And it is focalized through a puppy who's got lost in the midwinter. It's Christmas time in it's kind of wilds of Sweden, and it's an extraordinary, sustained sort of experiment in using human language to give a little bit of a glimpse of a canine, a possible canine experience. I mean, obviously we have to be aware of anthropomorphizing and projecting, and we're always going to do that to a certain degree, but she'd done a lot of research into the ways in which dogs sort of cognize the world, and endeavored to put this into language. It's really, really superb. But with the second question, just to give you an example in the sense of what I was talking about before, how literary studies can become more socially engaged. David Higgins, and indeed Tess, you yourself, I believe, were involved with the project with the Wordsworth Trust. Maybe you should correct me if I get this wrong, Tess, but bringing the sort of romantic literature of disaster into kind of public conversation about, thinking about disaster in the kind of context of environmental and climate change in the Lake District. And I just think this is a really wonderful development, partly because I'm getting sick of sitting behind a computer at my desk, and I just love the idea of being out there with people kind of exploring kind of new ways of understanding this literature and connecting it with the situation that we're in. And there are many other examples I could provide as well, but I think it's an exciting new development within literary studies.
Yes, we ran workshops with the Wordsworth Trust, and local people came and read romantic poems and then used them as inspiration to write about their own experience of the Cumbrian floods in 2015. And it was astonishing, really, how much having that prompt in the form of the romantic poems kind of opened up, or I don't know, gave people permission to write these poems about their own experiences of a changing climate and of disasters and so on. So that was a kind of very practical instance in which literature was able to speak beyond academia, I suppose. I'm conscious we're running out of time. There are a few questions left. I don't know if Kate or David, you would like to kind of type some answers or thoughts in response to them, but I'm conscious that we're running out of time and people need a break to get tea and coffee.